record here so we can get started. There we go. All right. Make presenter. All right.
Great. And from the looks of it, we've got about at least 9 people on the webinar. I just want to say welcome this evening. This is Peggy Reicher. I'm the Executive Director for the Brain Injury Alliance, and really want to thank all of you for being a part of this. I know some of you are calling in and some of you are watching from your computers, and we'll go ahead and have Sandy mute us just so that we're kind of avoiding some of the background noise.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and mute all. I might have to unmute Peggy here. Oh, sorry, I just had to unmute you really quickly.
Okay. All right. And just so you're all aware of it, we are going to go ahead and record this. So we had a handful of people that stated that they weren't going to be able to join at the time. So we're going to record it, and we'll be sending out the recording to those who'd registered, as well as we'll be putting it in our update that we send out this month. So again, thank you. And I really want to say special thanks to the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table. Sandy and Kenzie are joining us, and we'll be presenting some information after I'm done. So again, a sincere thanks to them for their assistance with this webinar this evening. What we're going to do is have folks ask questions as each of us get done presenting. And I think we're going to try having Sandy unmute the whole lines when we have time for questions. And if you're calling from a phone and are kind of not sure how to unmute at any time, you can unmute by just hitting #6, or is it? I think it's *6. So feel free to do that. And on that note, I'll go ahead and share my slides. This webinar kind of came about because of as we're working with the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table, and as we're preparing for 2020, knowing that voting rights is really important, as well as making sure that folks with disabilities are counted on the census. So you're going to see us talk about that. And let's see, I got to get my slides to advance here. There we go. Just a quick overview, though. What BIA, Brain Injury Alliance of Nebraska, our mission is to create a better future for all Nebraskans through brain injury prevention, education, advocacy, and support. And these webinars, this is our second webinar I think we've done on topics of kind of civic engagement. Last year we did one regarding ways to get involved with some legislation. And what I have for you is going to share with you some information here about the Brain Injury Trust Fund and its implementation, since that was passed this last year. And again, then after I will be presenting, you're going to hear more about voting and the importance of the 2020 census, and then also what are some action steps that you can take to make your voice count. So a little bit more in providing some just background about the Brain Injury Trust Fund is in 2010, and that's been quite a while ago, and there's been a few updates along the way, but the 2010 State Brain Injury Needs and Resource Assessment identified a handful of barriers, one of them being the lack of case management resource facilitation. The second thing was lack of awareness and knowledge, and lack of services and service awareness. And what that means, just knowing where to find services. The other critical needs that were identified by providers, those are the programs that provide services to individuals with brain injury. So they felt like they definitely needed more information about training, or they needed, excuse me, more training about brain injury specific needs. They also noted that they felt like there wasn't a great awareness about brain injury across the state. Also, in the brain injury world, we seem to have lacked advocacy. And also, funding has always been an issue. Trying to find specific funding for brain injury has been a challenge. So with that study and throughout the course of the years, we received some, did some smaller surveys and found that it was a lot of these things were still an issue even years later. So I felt like this is the information that we ended up taking actually to the senators and advocating for why we needed a brain injury trust fund. So when we talked with the senators this last year about what we would like to have funding for, specifically we had said our top priorities were to expand resource facilitation, which is a service that we BIA provide, and essentially what we're doing is trying to link individuals to different brain injury resources across the state. Unfortunately, not every part of the state has much for brain injury resources, but if there's not, then I know Chris and Gina work super hard to try to create those resources the best we can. We've also, in the funding priorities, we said, again, in trying to answer the needs of the needs and resource assessment, we said it would be great if we'd had funding for some training for service providers. Also in our state, we have a brain injury registry, and that is if individuals go to the hospital and are identified as having a brain injury, then a letter, and that is kind of in a partnership with Department of Education, Voc Rehab, and also Health and Human Services and the BIA. Right now, we are blessed with the funding to send out those letters comes actually from some federal dollars that VR is receiving, but if those VR dollars or those federal dollars to VR ever should end, then the trust fund could also possibly pay for the mailings of those registry letters. Public service, or public awareness activities was another hot priority, and support for brain injury research and just evaluation of quality brain injury services. So with this, what we're finding is that really the research and the evaluation of quality services is really just providing kind of some follow-up, and are we being good stewards of the dollars? Are we doing what is still needed? So that's that falls in what we mean by supporting research and quality of brain injury services. So the Brain Injury Trust Fund, with the help of probably some of you or many of you on the phone or watching this webinar, who had contacted your senators and reached out to those asking for their support. We actually, the spring of this year in 2019, that trust fund was passed, and we had Senator McDonald was our cheerleader and our champion, and then he, in partnership with Senator Kate Bowles, also helped get it passed. So it was 10 years in the making. I think we've been trying for about 10 years to get a brain injury trust fund, so we did a little celebration at the end of that. Funding will not be available until July 2020, but in the meantime, we've been working on trying to get things set up so we're ready to go once those funds do come. Right now, we had originally asked for $1 million because that's what our neighbors are getting over in Iowa, and we were able to get them to agree to $500,000, but that'll be per year annually. So it's not the $1 million, but it's better than the zero we've been receiving. So again, it was reason for celebration. We at least got to start. So this last few months, we've been spending time just trying to figure out how do we implement this now that we've got some funding. The way the bill was written up, or the trust fund was written up, is that the UNMC would be the state agency that received the funds through the healthcare cash fund. UNMC will receive about 10% of the funds just to go for administrative cost. And so the last few months we've been talking quite a bit with them and just trying to figure out how does this, what's this process, and how does this all work. We'll continue to work with them, and I think we've got it figured out how the funds will probably go from the healthcare cash fund with some help from DHHS that'll eventually get those to UNMC. But the most important part probably for all of you to be aware of is another component of the bill is that we have a Brain Injury Trust Fund Oversight Committee. And the purpose of this oversight committee is just to make sure that we've got others, so it's not UNMC making the decisions how the money is spent, but it's actually individuals with brain injury, and I'll show you the list here real soon, but what the oversight committee is charged to do is to provide the oversight and direction for how the funds are being spent. They will also develop the criteria for the expenditures. And again, the Trust Fund Committee is there to represent the interests of individuals with brain injuries and their families. Those that will be on the Trust Fund Committee, the governor will appoint the committee. When we wrote up the legislation, we identified that it should be 9 public members, and then we also have directors or their designee from 3 departments. The 9 public members will include a combination of individuals with brain injury or family members. There will be at least 1 representative from a public or private health related organization, so that could be any of the hospitals here in the state. Then the third kind of representative will come from the Developmental Disability Advisory or Planning Group. And 4th one is a representative of a service provider for individuals with brain injury. So that might be a service provider through the Developmental Disability Services, or again, that could be somebody that, a home health care agency, or a program that somehow provides any sort of services to people with brain injury. The 5th one is just a representative of a nonprofit brain injury advocacy organization. And the directors of the kind of from the state perspective will be the Commissioner of Education, the Director of Behavioral Health, or Public Health. And again, that will be either the directors themselves or their designee. For those of you who are kind of fall in any one of those categories, we certainly encourage you to get involved, as the slide shows. The ways to get considered for the committee. Just because you apply to get on the committee doesn't mean you get on the committee, but if you want to throw your name in the hat, you're more than welcome to do so. And the way in which to do that. So I've got a link here on our website, but it's the governor's website. And essentially complete this, it's called the Executive Appointment Form, and it's on the website. And if anyone needs more help in getting linked to this, just let me know, and I'm happy to help you out. But there's a whole list of different committees and commissions. The Brain Injury Trust Fund Committee is not yet on their list of, I don't know, hundreds. I think there's at least a couple hundred commissions and committees already formed. But if you happen to fill out the form, you essentially put on there that it's for the Brain Injury Trust Fund Committee, and they've assured me that they'll make sure the governor knows that that goes into that pot of that stash of individuals that are interested in being on that committee. Right now, they're taking applications at this time if people want to fill out that form. And at this point, what I've been told, and I'm sure this is subject to change, but right now they're telling us that they will anticipate probably selecting the committee members in May of 2020, and that's in preparation for the July 2020 funds being available. At this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions I'm unmuted, and if any of you have questions, happy to take those at this time.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, hi. I just had a question. A friend forwarded me the email about this call tonight, and I have a family member that has a brain injury. So I was wondering if you could just maybe provide just quickly. I wasn't on the first part of the call. I don't want to waste time, but just like the quick overhaul of kind of like some of the main hopes of the trust fund and what that will do, or unless there's another place I can look for the information.
Sure. The overall hope for the trust fund is that we're essentially providing support for people with brain injury across the state. Again, our original intent is, based on the needs and resource assessment. Folks were saying they felt like they needed more information about resource, and what we provide is resource facilitation or support in their community where they can find services. And how can resource facilitation maybe help create some support for them within their community? The money is not, maybe it's almost better to explain it this way, it's not intended to be for paying for somebody's housing or somebody's transportation needs or somebody's physical or occupational therapy needs. It's not meant to be the funds to pay for somebody's one-on-one support, but it's meant to really be more for how do we create an infrastructure and overall supports across Nebraska. Does that
Thank you.
help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions right now?
How often will the committee meet and where?
Good question. So that is yet to be kind of determined by, once the committee gets, is formed, it'll be up to the committee to make that decision. It might be, whether it's in Omaha, Lincoln, or outstate, I'm not exactly sure where they will meet, but again, it'll be up to the committee to make that decision. I believe, and I should have double checked, but I think, I want to say there's a minimum of 4 times a year that they meet, but don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and double check how we wrote that up. I would imagine, at least at the very beginning when the committee forms, that they're going to have to meet more frequently just to keep it going.
We also have a question in the chat box from Chris.
Okay, I gotta figure out how to get to the chat box here.
Here, I can read it off. It says, it's from Chris Stewart. Peggy, is there a set of bylaws or rules which are already created for the committee, or will the committee have to create those from scratch?
They will have to create those from scratch. That's one thing we chatted with the governor's office, like, being new to this, is like, okay, do you got a set of rules that we can just use? Their response was, nope, you got to do that yourself. So I think UNMC will probably have to be instrumental in helping with that. I know we've done a little bit of poking around already to look at how other commissions or groups have what they have for bylaws. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to at least give a template on what it could look like based on what some others have done. But that will be part of one of the reasons why I think the committee will have to get together more frequently, at least at first, to make sure they get those drawn up.
And Susie, and I'm sorry for meeting you, Susie, just the background noise, but Susie asked if this was opened across the whole state.
It is, yes, this is a statewide effort. So anybody can apply to be on that. And the hope is that, yeah, those services will reach across the state. And I think
You have to have.
I was gonna say, the thing to also keep in mind though is, even though 500,000 is certainly better than zero than Nebraska has invested in the past, I think it's it's still going to be hard to meet everybody's needs, but that's what we'll continue to advocate for, more funding as we go.
Do you have to have board experience to be on the committee?
You do not have to have board experience. That wasn't written into the legislation. Of course, if you have some, that's always helpful, but it's certainly not a requirement. The only requirements are those that what you saw is that you kind of fit in the category of kind of that description. Are you an individual with a brain injury or a family member, and so on and so forth. I think with that, I think just so we have time to have the others present, I think we'll go ahead and I'll turn it back over to Sandy and Kenzie for their part of the presentation. And if folks have further questions, I'm more than happy to answer them after their presentation too.
Awesome. I'm gonna give the reins over to Kenzie. I'm gonna mute everyone back again, but we will have time for questions again after Kenzie's part and mine as well. And then any other questions you have for Peggy.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here and talk to you today. I'm from Civic. I'm from the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that serves as a backbone to support other nonprofits in Nebraska, like Brain Injury Alliance, as they do the important work of increasing civic engagement in the communities that they're working in. So my name is Kenzie Mavon. I'm the field director for the table, and today I'm going to be talking to you about registering to vote, your rights at the ballot box, and how to be a leader in your community in 2020. My background is in community organizing, specifically around voting rights, so this is a passion thing for me. Also with us today, and who is leading the meeting, who is our tech queen, is Sandy Griffin. She's our field manager at the table, and she's going to be talking to you about the importance of the upcoming 2020 census, and hopefully we'll be answering any questions you may have.
All right.
So
we're just waiting to view your screen, so as soon as you can share that.
Hold on. Hold up. I'm figuring it out. See? That's the problem. That's why you're the tech queen.
I do not work with our data team, but alas, I got a quick training meeting.
So here we go.
There we go.
Cancel. There we go. Present. There we go. So that's me. That's Sandy. Tech queen. I'm not the tech queen, as you just learned. So hopefully most of you are registered to vote if you are able to vote. But just in case, I wanted to quickly go over ways to register if you're not. You can register to vote both on paper and online. Using paper registrations, you can either use your Nebraska driver's license number or the last four of your social security number. That can be turned in by mail, or it can be turned in person at the election commissioner. Registering online is actually within the last few years. It's pretty new in Nebraska. And so to register online, you need a Nebraska driver's license number. You cannot use the last four of your social, unfortunately. So here are some deadlines for the elections in 2020. Your last days to register for the primary are April 24th for mail-in or online, and May 1st if you register in person at the election commissioner. Your last day to register before the general election are October 16th by mail or online, and October 20th in person. And here's like a little bit of how the voter registration form looks like, the paper one. We've highlighted the most important sections to fill out, and it's really important that you fill out these sections. So those are the first two questions. So are you a citizen, and will you be 18 by the election? Your full name, your birth date, place of birth, your driver's license or last four of your social, as we talked about, party affiliation, your phone number so that the election commissioner can contact you if there are any issues with your form, and then date and signature at the bottom of the page. And it is really important to remember that if you choose other in party affiliation, you have to write something in. The four affiliations on the form are the only ones recognized by the state of Nebraska, but if you don't fill that in, it won't count, like you won't be registered to vote. If you want to register online and receive election reminders, you can visit nebraskatable.turbovote.org. It looks just like it does here at the top of this slide. It's a really cool tool, and you don't even have to register to vote if you just want the election reminders. They come either via text or email. You can choose that, and they send you, a week before the election or 2 weeks before the election to remind you that that's coming up. If you aren't sure that you're registered, or you need help finding your polling place, or you want to make sure your absentee ballot was accepted, you can visit votercheck.necvr.ne.gov. Or if you're like me, you can just Google VoterCheck Nebraska, because that's really hard to remember, and it's a very complicated website address. But again, that website can help you figure out whether or not you're registered, where you're registered, what your polling place will be, whether or not your provisional ballot got accepted, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, and then checking to see whether or not your application for your absentee ballot was accepted, if your ballot got mailed out, and then if it was accepted in the end. Voting is really important because it truly does affect our day-to-day lives. Our representatives can affect access to medical care, maintenance of emergency systems, and implementing laws that we've already voted on. It is so important to make your voice heard, and I truly believe that if we don't vote, we're letting other people make decisions for us. The state of Nebraska has made efforts to increase ballot accessibility for all voters, including elderly voters, voters with disabilities, voters who do not read or speak English, voters residing in assisted living centers, long-term facilities, or who are hospitalized. In the state of Nebraska, all polling places must meet strict accessibility standards, but this doesn't mean everyone can get to their polling place. So if you can't, you have a couple options. You can vote early at the election commissioner's office. I would suggest calling your election commissioner when it's around that time to vote to figure out what their office hours are and when early voting starts. You can vote by mail with no excuse in Nebraska and return your ballot by mail or via a drop box location. You do have to apply for a ballot to be mailed to you at least 2 weeks before the election. The earlier the better, but some places like Lancaster and Douglas County have permanent mailing lists. So I am on the permanent mailing list because I don't like going to the polling place on election day. And every year that there's an election, I just get a postcard in the mail. I check a box saying, yes, I am me. I want my ballot in the mail again, and I mail it back, and then I get my ballot in the mail. You can also, a lot of people don't know this, but you can also have a friend pick up your ballot and deliver it to you. That's called being an agent. People can be an agent for 2 people. They just have to know your name, birth date, and the address that you're registered at, and they can pick it up for you and drop it off for you, or you can mail it in. They also do have to sign something, and that's how they keep track of how many ballots that you've taken as an agent. So as a voter, you actually have a ton of rights, and I wanted to mention some of them because I don't think they're talked about as often. If you are in need of assistance in reading or marking your ballot, you may request that assistance from election officials, or you can bring a friend. If you need translation or interpretation assistance, you can also bring a friend. If you go to the polling place but you are physically unable to enter it, you may remain in your vehicle and vote curbside so long as you are parked within a block of the polling place. You can use an auto mark machine. If you need a chair, magnifiers, or signature guides, you can request them and they will be provided. Some other rights you shouldn't forget are you may receive a provisional ballot if you are not listed on the voter rolls. A provisional ballot is just a ballot that has to be double checked, basically. So if you go to your polling place and they say that you're not on the list, there may have been a mistake, something with the computer, who knows, but you know that this is your polling place, you've checked, you truly think that this is your polling place, request a provisional ballot, and then you'll have to sign your name and put your address and all that stuff, but you can still vote. If you mess up when marking your ballot, you can get another one. In fact, you can get up to 4 in the state of Nebraska. Please don't do that for fun. We want to save the trees, but just so you know, if you mess up, you can get another one. You can ask the poll workers about how to cast your ballot. If the instructions are unclear, if you don't know whether or not to X or to fill in a circle, you can ask those questions. And something that I think is really important is you can bring in notes with you about how you'd like to vote. Again, this is a reason why I like to vote by mail, because I like to have my computer up with different voter guides in front of me, trying to figure out who's for what, what's about what, I don't know what's going on. It's very important that if you want to make sure to keep notes, you can, and you can absolutely bring that in with you. And then a fun thing in Nebraska that became law is you can take a picture of yourself, you can take a selfie, in the ballot box or in the ballot booth. The next, I kind of want to talk about being a leader in your community in 2020. It's a really big year. There's the census. There's, of course, always the legislation. You have committees coming up, and we have an election. So some things you can do to take charge in your community are registering other people to vote. It's something that I do every time my friends move. They might find it annoying. I think it's charming. But when you help people register to vote, there's a couple things you should really remember. One, once you give them the form, you cannot answer any questions about the form or a party or party affiliation, but you can assist with translation if they need it, and you can tell them which sections are most important before you hand it over. Those sections are the ones we talked about earlier, the first two questions: full name, birth date, place of birth, license or social, party affiliation, phone number, date, and signature. We call this pre-teaching it to somebody, and we find that that really helps with any confusion that people have as they're filling out their voter registration form. Next, talking to your friends and family about the election and why it's important to you. We actually know, those of us who do voter engagement work know that it is more effective to have people that you know and love talk to you about voting. So it's really our job to help each other. I challenge each of you to talk to 5 of your friends and family and get them to pledge to vote in 2020. It is that important. And last but not least, I want you to be proud of being a voter. I think it's really important for voting and civic engagement in general to be a large part of public life, something that people talk about and are proud of. I really encourage you to weave this conversation in when talking to your family and friends. It is huge to feel like you're an active participant in your community, and we want everyone to know how cool you think it is. I'm sure my friends, I actually have a few friends who never voted before I started being really proud and excited about it, and was able to help them find their polling place and register to vote and figure out what was on the ballot. So that just goes to show that if we're all in it together, we can really make a change in our small networks, and that's a big deal. So I know that I talk a little fast, and this is a short section, but does anyone have any questions about registering to vote?
Kenzie, I have one question. This is Peggy. You had mentioned about going to the election commissioner's office. How do you find the address or the phone number for that? Is that just is that usually in the county courthouse, or whereabouts are those folks, and how do you find them?
So in smaller counties, it is usually in the county courthouse. It's actually usually the county clerk is usually the same thing, but the Secretary of State has a list of all of the election commissioners on their website. You can also just Google whatever your county is, election commissioner. So I'm from Gage County originally, so I would put Gage County, Nebraska election commissioner, and that will pull it up.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no more questions, and there will be time at the end for questions, I'm just going to go ahead and hand it off to Sandy so she can talk to you about the census.
Let's see here. Let me take over the controls back to myself.
Oh, if you have voted in the past and haven't moved, do you need to register? No. If you have not moved, you will not need to re-register. If you haven't voted in 10 years, you might be removed from voter rolls. But in general, you shouldn't have to re-register, and re-registering isn't going to hurt you. It's not going to be a problem. And I see one more question here. Whoop, from Chris. My thing won't stop scrolling down. A lot of attention on position of president. Yeah, so the positions that we vote for that are really important to individual lives, I would say you have city mayors, you have city council, you have county, oh my goodness, I'm losing my train of thought. But we also elect our school board, and that's like your children, right? Like the children in your area. So there's a lot of stuff, city and local, that you don't want to miss out on, as well as Nebraska has a lot of ballot initiatives. So in 2018, we passed Medicaid expansion, and that was done via the ballot because our legislature was kind of deadlocked about it. So you want to make sure that you are checking out all of the state and local things that are happening. And Civic Nebraska is another nonprofit that every election year, every big election year, has a, I don't know what to call it, it's like a one-pager that's called Decoding the Ballot, and it explains what the different positions do. Not who's running, but like, what does a city council member do? And so that's a great resource, as well as to find information about the candidates, you can go to vote411.org. That's the League of Women Voters, and they do a voter guide every year, and it can, if you put in your address, it'll be personalized to you. And these are all nonpartisan resources because that's who the table and Brain Injury Alliance are. So yeah, feel free to get in touch if you have any more questions. And there will be time at the end.
All right, with that, I'm going to take back over the controls here and share my screen, and we can talk about the census. All right, so my name is Sandy Griffin. I'm the field manager at the table, and a lot of my work this year is really focused on the 2020 census. So today I'll just be talking about what the census is, how to fill the census out, and ultimately why the census is really important. So the census is a count of the U.S. population that occurs every 10 years. It's required by the Constitution, and it's only about 10 questions long. They mainly ask about your age, your race, your ethnicity, your name, your address. It's a pretty standard list of questions, but it has to be answered for everyone who lives in that household, no matter how old or how young they are. And the census is really important because it determines equal representation in government. It determines how civil rights and voting rights legislation is enforced, and it really returns tax dollars and resources back to those communities. So the federal government determines basically determines funding for states and communities based on those census population counts. So if someone isn't being counted, that's money that the federal government is not allotting for that community. So in fiscal year 2016, that amount was around $4 billion in federal funds that got sent back to Nebraska based on the 2010 census. So the consequences of this are, if someone is missed in the census, if someone doesn't fill out the census but still lives in that area, that can cost the state of Nebraska up to $20,000 over the course of 10 years. And even if the census count is only off by 0.1%, that can be $4 million. And ultimately, when we're talking about the loss of funding and not having an accurate count, that affects things like healthcare. It affects things like SNAP. It affects special education grants and the Children's Health Insurance Program, Head Start, Medicaid, all of these different really important federally funded resources that really depend on having an accurate count from the census to get the funding that they need. As far as what's different about the 2020 census is, for the first year, people have the option to respond online or by phone. In the past, you've only had the option to fill out the census on paper when it's mailed to you, but in 2020, you'll have 3 different options for self-response. You can fill it out over the phone through the Census Questionnaire Assistance Program, you can fill it out online, or you can fill it out on paper. And how this will look for you is you'll get a postcard in the mail with information on how to fill out the census online or by phone. They'll send out some reminder postcards. It'll include a code to just make it easier. You don't need the code necessarily, but it really helps in the process. If you lose the code, it's not the end of the world. And then if you do not fill out the census online or by phone during that time period, you'll get the census in the mail. And then you can just fill it out like every other year. And people are usually counted at their current place of residence or usual residence on April 1st. It really depends on the situation for how this looks like. If you're just staying the night at a friend's place, or you have a regular usual residence that you just don't happen to be at on April 1st, you would of course put your usual residence as your address on that day. But if you're, say, a college student living away from home in an apartment, then you would put down your new apartment number or something like that. For folks experiencing homelessness, it's wherever they're usually at or staying on April 1st. And there are basically two different processes for the census. What I've been talking about is self-response, so that's you answering the questionnaire yourself, just having that survey sent to you and sending it back in some form or another. But dorms, shelters, assisted living facilities, prisons, any sort of group quarter facility goes through a separate count. So that's done by the administrators of the people that are managing that facility, and the people individually don't have to worry about filling out the census. And I'll go a little bit more into detail with this in the frequently asked questions section, but that should give you an idea. As for filling out the census, if folks are living in an assisted living facility, they'd be counted in the group quarters process, and thus don't really have to worry about the census or self-responding, because all of that information is collected and sent to the Census Bureau through the administrators working there. If someone's living with someone in their home, it's expected that they're just included in the household. When you get the census, you'll just be marking down everyone that lives there, their name, their demographic information. It's not several different forms. It's just you keep adding household members to the same form. For self-response assistance for folks with disabilities, the Census Bureau does have a few different resources available. The Census Bureau does provide large print and braille questionnaires, as well as they do operate telephone contact centers with technology devices for the deaf, technology for the phone questionnaire, and the internet questionnaire will also be accessible to individuals with disabilities, according to the Census Bureau. People can also receive help filling out the census form through the helpline that should be available on everyone's postcard that I talked about earlier. And then when we talk about folks who are undercounted and why an undercount matters, as mentioned earlier, the census really does determine the number, the dollar amount of resources that go back to communities. And people that tend to not get counted in the census are people with low incomes, people with disabilities, renters, multi-generational households, people of color, cultural and linguistic minorities, immigrants, and households that include undocumented folks, young children, a lot of the people that need those federal resources the most. And that's the big problem with an undercount and why we're so passionate about making sure that people are included in the census and that people are filling out the census so we can make sure as many resources get to all of our communities as possible. And here's a map that sort of gives you an idea of what undercounted communities look like in Nebraska. The blue areas that you see on the map tend to be severely undercounted. We have some higher concentrations in Lincoln and Omaha, as well as across the state, as you can see. Green areas are just slightly undercounted. That's about 15 to 20% undercounted. And the more tan areas have a little bit more of an equitable count. And the purple areas are Native American reservations that go by a little bit of a different count procedure. And for the timeline of the census, from February to June, that's the count for the group quarters. As we talked about earlier, that's shelters, dorms, assisted living facilities, detention centers, military bases, anything like that. From March 12th to 20th, that's when the census is going to be sending out those postcards and when people should be getting those postcards to respond to the census online or over the phone. People should get reminder postcards and letters as well in case they just don't get the first one. April 1st is that census day that serves as a reference for where people are living on that day for the census and what address to put down on their census form. April 8th to 16th is when those paper copies of the census will start to get sent out. And late April to July will be when census workers follow up on people who just haven't responded to the census yet. So if you don't want a census worker to show up at your door, just make sure to fill out the census early and those census workers won't bother you. From August to December, that's the quality evaluation through the Census Bureau, and on December 31st, that's when the count is delivered to the president. Here are some frequently asked questions about the census, and then I'll open it up for other questions at the end. I apologize for speaking sort of quickly, so hopefully I can clarify any questions at the end when that's opened up. But a big question that a lot of people have is who has access to that information? So personal information will not and cannot be shared outside of the Census Bureau. The only thing that's shared out to the broader public or even just outside of the Census Bureau is demographic information. So you can see by neighborhood or by census tract what the demographics of that area are. So say the percentage of people in that census tract that are female, or the percentage of people in that census tract that are Hispanic, or any other demographic statistic. It does not specify people's names. It doesn't attach that census information to anyone's name. It's completely anonymous. This information is encrypted and it cannot be shared outside of the Census Bureau. If you lose your code to fill out the census online, the code helps, but it's not a complete necessity to filling out the census. You can still fill out the census online or over the phone without it, and you will get follow-up postcards and mailing reminders as well. If you got a long survey in the mail that was more than 10 questions that said it was from the Census Bureau, you probably got the American Community Survey. It's different from the census, even though it's operated by the Census Bureau. It just gets more in-depth information about people, and it's just a broader survey. We would encourage you to fill it out because it does provide a lot of valuable information to the community, but it's different from the census. And last slide here, people can participate if they're not citizens. You do not have to be a U.S. citizen to be counted in the census. It's only intended to count residents. You don't have to meet legal residency standards. It's intended to count people living there. That even includes international students. That includes basically anyone who's living in the area, minus people who are just on vacation in the United States for a week or something along those lines. The census does not ask about disabilities. There are a few different surveys that are operated by the Census Bureau that do. The American Community Survey, the longer survey that I mentioned earlier, will sometimes do that. And there are a few other surveys, like the Survey of Income and Program Participation and the Current Population Survey that do, but they're not the same thing as the census. And another thing that has come up a lot this year is the citizenship question. The idea that the census would include a question about citizenship. The census is not including a citizenship question. That will not be on the 2020 census. And for folks that are ever worried about census information being used to deport them or their family members, that information that's shared with the Census Bureau has to stay completely confidential and anonymous. If any of that information is shared that is not allowed to be shared, census workers face up to a $250,000 fine or up to 5 years in prison. The information is encrypted, and like I said earlier, the only information that's sent out outside of the Census Bureau is that anonymous information about demographics. ICE, the FBI, any other government organization that is not the Census Bureau cannot access that information legally. And with that, I will open it up for questions. I know we got a couple in the chat box, but I'm just going to open it up. All right.
Hey, Sandy, there's some questions written down. So we have a question from Denise, which is, was there a pre-census effort? I had a census worker stalking me for weeks, even sent me letters via FedEx, wanted more info than were typical census questions. I only answered what I knew were required census questions. 2 months later, they called to try to get those, and I didn't answer.
Okay. What may have happened is the Census Bureau does test beforehand. There was even a test that went out with the citizenship question included, even though that's not on the final census. The Census Bureau does conduct some tests just to see what works in the field and test response measures. I don't know that they would necessarily harass you that thoroughly, but it may have just been a test, and it is separate from the census. So you would still have to fill out the census when you get that postcard in March. It's also important to know that census workers should include official some official indication that they're working with the Census Bureau. If that ever escalated, or you ever felt like you were in a situation that felt uncomfortable, even if they looked like a census worker, I would encourage you to just reach out to the Census Bureau directly. There are a few different community organizations or community specialists that would be good to reach out to about that if it ever became a problem. But
and then Denise wants to know if they should expect to fill out the census again. They were the one who possibly did one of these tests and things like that.
Yeah. Any tests that were done for the census are separate from the actual census, so you would have to fill out the census again in March. So I'm sorry about that, but it may have just been a census test. But yeah, that is separate from the census.
Thanks, Andy. Those are the ones we have in the chat.
Awesome.
This is Peggy. I guess I have a question for you, Sandy. If a census worker comes to your door, how do they identify? I'm sure they identify themselves as a census worker, but is there anything that makes it official that we should be looking for?
They should have a name badge indicating, like, they should have the logo of the Census Bureau on them. In the event that you're concerned about it, I would again encourage folks to reach out by phone to the Census Bureau. But census workers outside of tests should not be knocking on people's doors unless you haven't filled out the census yet. There is a non-response period. I'll go back in this slide. That late April to July period, census workers will be out and knocking on people's doors. But outside of that, during this census period, outside of tests, census workers should not be knocking on folks' doors. There will be a few nonprofits that will be out as part of our Complete Count Committee that will be talking to folks about the census and reminding them about it that aren't affiliated with the Census Bureau. But our efforts on that front are just to educate folks about the census and make sure they know what's happening. Any other questions? All right, should we open the questions to just questions about anything in this presentation generally?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I guess that is the question. Does anybody else have any last questions or even comments that they want to share?
Kinsey, can you somehow post the vote one that you spoke about, finding out more about the candidates? Because it seems like we know everything you'd ever want to know and not know about the presidential candidates, but the judges and whatnot like that, it's very difficult to find any information. So you're basically voting on whose name you like best.
Yeah, so Sandy pulled it up on the screen right there, vote 411, but I imagine there will be a follow-up email going out, and we can collect some of the like resources and just like put it on a PDF with some lists of websites for everybody.
Yeah, I know I have a few different resources specifically about the census and disabilities that I'm happy to send out and that I've already collected. So I'd be happy to attach vote 411 to that too, if that works with you, Peggy, for the follow-up email.
Yeah, that would be great. And this might be, I have a question that you, just a quick question, which I don't know that either of you really know the answer to, but When it comes to individuals with disability, do you have, is there a best guess of how underrepresented they are at the ballot box or even within census? Is there a best guess on that?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure we can find that information.
Yeah, we would need one of our data people in here with us, because there are like lots of spreadsheets and lots of information that we can weed through. Excuse me, I've got a cold, so I'm a little coffee, but information is not something that I know offhand.
Okay, thank you.
Can a person request one of those special census ballots for disabilities, and does the person self-identify as having a disability, or is there a criteria they have to meet?
So on the postcard that folks should be getting for self-response, that should include a phone number for assistance, and the census worker should be able to help folks with whatever their needs are. I do not believe there's any sort of requirement of needing proof of a disability or anything like that, but those workers should be there to help anyone out with any questions they have and any accessibility needs they have, including needing any sort of special census form.
All right. Well, I know we're kind of nearing the end of our times. We're getting close to 7:30. So I just, if there's any, I guess one last shout out, are there any other questions? Well, hearing none, I just want to thank you all for your time and your participation this evening. I know it ends up being at the end of the day, but we were hoping we could catch more people because it was at the end of the day and not breaking into the working day. So again, thank you all for participating, and do get out there and vote, and do get yourself counted by filling out your census. And certainly the last call to action, if anyone's interested in being considered for the Brain Injury Trust Fund Committee, I encourage you to go to the governor's website and fill out the application. And certainly if anyone has questions about that, feel free to send me an email. Again, my email is Peggy, so it's PEGGY at B as in boy, I, A, N as in Nancy, E.org. I forgot to show that on my slides earlier. So feel free to give myself a call, or I'm sure Chris is always happy to help answer, kind of redirect people to me too. So again, thank you all, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you, ladies, for a great presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks all.